Okay, welcome everybody. Let's go ahead with the solar news for this week. There was an article about the recent Supreme Court ruling that essentially gutted the EPA's right to legislate, which is
clear to legislate.
I know. Well, it's sort of like if the legislature is not going to do it, somebody's going to do it. So the Supreme Court ruled essentially, no, even though the legislature is broken, it's their responsibility. They're the ones who are supposed to do it. So solar advocates are throwing up their arms now and going, oh my God, this is going to be the end of the universe for solar. So my guess is probably not. My guess also is, I don't know. I give up on politics. So, but I don't think that it's as cut and dry as many of the news articles are saying about the Supreme Court ruling. But we can be upset with them over other things. Okay, the beginning July 1st, Indiana, the state of Indiana, has basically gutted net metering. What they did is they put a law into effect that said investor-owned utilities no longer had to participate in net metering. And they replaced the one-for-one. So when you sell back and you get paid retail, they replaced that with something they're referring to as excess distributed generation, which to my understanding is essentially paying a wholesale generation fee for the net metered amount. So you buy at retail, you sell back at wholesale. A lower court ruled that this applied only to the amount that was in excess of what you consumed each month. So essentially there would be a one-for-one net metering, and then if you generate more than you use over the course of the month, they'll pay you wholesale for it, which again is the situation I'm under with my local, electrical co-op. So it didn't seem the end of the world, but then the Supreme Court of Indiana said, no, we're going to vacate that ruling, and then we're going to hear oral arguments in September. So essentially, they're referring to it as, instantaneous netting instead of monthly netting. So essentially, from kilowatt hour one, you get paid wholesale, but you're going to get charged retail. So that's kind of what advocates were trying to avoid. So it's a mess. So at this moment, Indiana does not have what would be referred to as a traditional net metering. The articles I read all said it did away with it. Well, it didn't do away with it. It's just paying wholesale instead of retail. What that will probably mean in Indiana, if you're somebody who wants to install a system, is you're going to want to go towards self-consumption. So there will be a lot of folks out there installing battery systems to say, why should I be sending power back to the grid when I just get paid wholesale and then later got to turn around and pay retail? Why don't I install some sort of battery system so I can consume as much or all of the power I'm generating on site? So that's an effective way to get around it. Once again, an article that was sort of put out there as it's the end of the world, but my guess is it is less so. We have other things that are destroying the world at a much more rapid pace, I think. In the good news area, Rhode Island just signed, the governor just signed a 100% renewables bill for that state. It's the first state to commit to statewide renewable consumption by 2033. So they're on track. There was a recent study by Wood Mackenzie that predicts that the solar industry will in fact grow at a lower rate than it did in past years, both this year and next year. This is largely due to a couple of things we've talked about. One is the supply chain disruption caused by the tariffs or the investigation of the tariff on the countries in Southeast Asia that were trying to get around the Chinese tariffs by simply taking Chinese modules, doing a little bit of work on them, and then saying they're from the main 4 countries were, if memory serves, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Those 4 countries account for about 85% of all of the utility scale solar panels in the US and about 80% of all of the commercial solar panels. So the investigation sort of put a halt on supply chain because there was the specter out there that they could impose as much as 200% tariffs on these panels should they be found in violation of the tariff law. Biden just recently announced that he's putting a 2-year hiatus on that, so hoping to free up the supply chain. This study says, yeah, that's good, but it's not going to do the trick. They're anticipating about a 25% reduction in growth. So it doesn't mean, you know, the industry is still going to grow, but at 25% less than what had been happening in 2021. At least that's their projection. The US Department of Energy, on the other hand, just released a study. It's the 2022 US Energy and Employment Report. And they're saying that the energy sector grew at a faster rate than the overall employment in the US. Energy sector grew at 4%, where the overall growth rate in jobs was 2.8%. A couple of notable things: solar was up 5.4%. Electric vehicles was up 26%. And hybrid electric vehicles was up almost 20%. And the energy industry actually employs veterans at a much higher rate. 9% of the workforce is veterans versus 6% overall. Despite the job growth, they don't anticipate that the job numbers will reach what they were pre-pandemic. So there was a fall off, and we've been slowly rebuilding, but we're not quite where we were, I guess, in 2019. So that's the news from solar. I know, Devanand, you had sent me a thing that I did a little bit of research on, but does anybody else have any questions or issues that have come to mind this week that you want to try and address here during the call? Yeah, Bill?
Yeah, I was one of the participants last week who was involved with putting in charge stations for EVs. I mentioned there he's working with a vendor in Houston, and is he on the call today? The guy that
I don't see him. No, it's Tony. I know Tony.
Tony. Okay, I wanted to see whether I find out who, so I could see whether they would like to speak at the Houston Electric Car Club meeting. And maybe if he comes on, I'll bring it up again.
Yeah, I think he said they were going to be headquartered in Houston, his company.
I think he said, yeah, okay.
Well, you can talk to him. If you need, I'll pass his email along to you.
Okay.
I'm sure he'd be happy to, if he's in Houston. I thought he was in California, but I'm not sure. It's just that all the EV guys are in California. So.
Yeah.
Hey, isn't he in Cleveland?
He might be in Cleveland. I mean, he attended the class in Dayton, so maybe he's an Ohio guy.
Yeah, I thought he was in Cleveland, and he was going to move his operations to Houston because of supply chain issues.
Yeah, that could be. That could be. All good things start in Ohio. So
we'll just move on from there.
We're the heart of it all here. I always think that Ohio should be considered the birthplace of energy, not the birthplace of aviation. You know, first off, we're not the birthplace of aviation, but
I thought Pennsylvania was the birthplace of energy. Wasn't that the first oil well?
No, they're lying about that. The first one was actually in Caldwell, Ohio.
Okay.
It's still there. You can still go there. Theirs was maybe the first commercially productive oil well, but the first oil well was actually 2 guys digging for salt, and up through the ground came a bubbling crude, and they actually just stuck a log in it, and it's still bubbling oil up out of the ground.
Okay.
It's a little park I talked to the Natural Gas Association that runs that park, pointing out that the very first oil well in North America is still polluting the groundwater because they just dug a ditch from this oil well and it drains into a nearby creek. So you can just follow the crude oil down into the creek. But they told me that wasn't true. So I guess that solved the problem. Although when I showed them pictures of it, and she still insisted it wasn't true. So I stand corrected, I guess. So, okay, anybody else have anything they want to bring up before we do the supply side item?
Well, part of that thing is I heard that the new Intel plant is put on hold right now because they can't get parts and labor.
Oh, really? You mean for the semiconductors in the plant in New Albany, huh?
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, you know, part of this supply chain thing with solar comes from the Uyghur, what do they call it? The Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And
slaves?
Yeah, it's slave labor in China. But there is this act that went into effect July 1st that says if you want to buy anything from the Uyghur province, then it has to be documented that every single person who was involved with the production of this did not, in fact, use forced labor or slave labor. Well, 80% of the polysilicon comes from the Uyghur district in China. And that's used not only in solar panels, but in semiconductors. So it's a big paperwork nightmare. And not to be said that it's not a good thing. Obviously, we don't want slave labor doing this, but it will be very disruptive, not only to the solar industry, but to the semiconductor industry, which is already having some problems. And I think, again, as we've discussed in previous sessions, that is emblematic of when you offshore critical supply chain, you know. So we're suffering that at the moment. We've had a number of disruptions, and I suspect that they'll simply continue in ways we can't anticipate. Okay. Anybody else have anything before I jump into supply? Not supply chain. In this case, what we're talking about is supply side or line side connection of a solar PV system. And just to make sure, Devin, that I'm getting what your question was directly, when you typically hook up a small solar array for a residential, you usually go into the service panel. And if you're connecting to a breaker on the customer side of the main disconnect, that's referred to as a load side connection. And then you have the alternative of hooking in somewhere between the main disconnect and the meter. That would be a supply chain disconnect or connection. And usually for larger systems or commercial systems, they will do a supply side or a line side connection as opposed to a load side. And one of the main reasons for that is because load side connections, you're restricted to 120% of the bus bar rating on your service panel. So if you've got 200 amp service coming in, what that basically means is you're restricted to 40 amps connecting in from the PV array. Well, 40 amps isn't going to cut it for a commercial system. And even if they've got a 400 amp supply with a 80 amps probably isn't going to cut it either. So oftentimes you'll connect between the meter and the main disconnect. Okay, is that, and you're looking at doing a number of those at the moment?
Well, I'm actually involved in a couple of commercial scale grid type projects, and I have to do some costing for these systems right now. So I'm looking at the switchgear hardware requirements to make those line side connections, whether it's by taps or junction box. But we don't have any suppliers like that in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
So after this, I kind of send it out here to see who I can make a contact, who might be able to provide, give me supplies, information on where I mean, obviously, different commercial system size will have different requirements, but at least if I have an intended to a company that provides these type of hardware, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, the issue is going to be, of course, this is straight electrical work when you're talking about a supply side or a line side connection. It's all AC. So you should be able to get these junction boxes from any electrical supplier, distributor like a Gray Bar or a Square D or Schneider or any of those kind of guys. But I have a picture here. I think this is what you're probably looking at, something like this, where you'll come in and make the tap. So you'll have your main line, you know, one of the hots coming in here and leaving here, and you'll tap in onto a bus bar for, you know, line 1, line 2, line 3, if it's 3-phase, neutral. So it's really just bus bars connected into some sort of junction box, all with the right ampacity rating for this system. But there are a couple of things that are that come into play. So remember, this connection is going to be between the meter and the main disconnect. It can be anywhere within there, within that row. But there are some ampacity calculations, and it depends on whether it's a 10-foot tap or a 25-foot tap. So basically, you're not, you would come from your inverter, and then you would go to an AC disconnect, just similar to what you do with any kind of system. That AC disconnect has to be, if you're going to do a supply side, has to be rated according to the 10-foot tap rule or the 25-foot tap rule. And what these tap rules are is if the line between the AC disconnect and where you're connecting to the feeder conductor, the thing coming in from the utility, is 10 feet or less, the equation is going to be 10% times the feeder tap's breaker rating. So let's say if that's a 200 amp service or a 400 amp service, that's the breaker rating, plus the inverter output ampacity times 1.25. So, so what, let's say just as a simple residential example, we have 200 amp service coming in from the utility, and we're doing a 10-foot tap. And we've got, let's say 50 amp output from our inverter. So I would take the 200 amps plus 50 amps from the inverter times 1.25, which would be what, 62.5, 62 and a half? So then you would take 10% times 262.5 amps, or the conductor has to be at least 26 amps rated. However, it cannot be less than 60 amp rated. So in
so there's no matching with the mains coming in from the utility in that sense? Not necessarily?
You don't have to meet like the 200 amp wire coming in, because the ampacity should not flow back to the inverter unless there's a ground fault. So you use either the 10-foot tap, which is 10% of the feeder breaker plus the inverter output times 1.25, or the 25-foot tap, which is 33% or a third times the feeder breaker plus the inverter output times 1.25. But in no case can it be less than 60 amps.
Yeah, I know that.
Okay, but there must be a breaker or a fuse. This AC disconnect has to be fused. And it has to then protect up to, you know, it has to protect that wire. So what they're saying is a large amount of current could flow in from the utility, but only if there's a ground fault somewhere in your system. So your AC disconnect is then going to serve as the breaker or the fuse to protect your inverter and everything else on the AC line. But then from the AC disconnect to the utility, the output on that should only be whatever the maximum of the inverter is. But they use the 10-foot tap or the 25-foot tap rule, which gives you a little bit more to spare. Okay, so did I confuse everybody or anybody? Bill's nodding his head. Okay, that he is confused or that he understands it. Let me see. I have, trying to think if I've got my little whiteboard, but this, the reason why people will use supply side is there are a number of reasons. Obviously, for larger commercial systems, you end up with more amperage than your service panel can handle. Or you might have a residential system that doesn't have any space in the service panel. So you've got to then do a supply side or a line side connection. Or your utility might require it. There are a number of reasons why this might be the case, but it does require that the utility get involved with your connection, because you've got to either pull the meter or you've got to disconnect at the transformer, because you can't make this connection when the lines are live. So if it's new construction, you know, that's one thing, because say your system is not energized yet, you can put in the wire just like you're wiring the building. But in your case, Devanand, is this an existing structure that you're adding the array to?
No, this is new systems. New systems going up on. Yeah.
Okay, so you can just wire this up when the building is being wired and feed into that tap. And you need that disconnect, and it's got to be in a readily accessible area. You can't have more than 6 handles to turn off your service. So all of those things, all the other things apply. Let me see if I can share my whiteboard. All right, so let's see. All right, so let's say this is our meter, and somewhere in here is our main service panel. This is the main. And we've got our inverter or multiple inverters over here. So a supply side connection is going to come out here to an AC disconnect. And then it's going to tap in at a junction box or something like that, somewhere in this line. Now they do have systems you can tap in inside the service panel box. That's a little cumbersome, I think. Or you can tap in at the meter. That again, some utilities won't allow this. But typically you're going to just get a straight electrical box, come in, cut the main line coming in, hook it into a bus bar, and feeder tap in. So let's say that this is, I'll throw some numbers out. Let's say it's a 90 amp AC output. And this is, do you know what the ampacity of this service is going to be that's already there?
No, not sure. I know it's 3-phase, 480 volts. I haven't got the low detail yet to work out the requirements and the capacity rating.
Okay.
But I was going to base it up on the fact that the size of the grid tie system may have been like about 120 kilowatts in size. And I was trying to match a string inverter, or a series of string inverters close to those values. Keeping in mind, of course, the DC side would be slightly higher than the AC side.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stick with single phase because I don't want to have to do anything in the square root of 3. So you can figure your amps yourself. But let's say this is, we'll just say 400 amp service coming in. All right. So if we were to look up and see what the wire size is here, I don't know, you guys probably use millimeter wire size down there and not American wire gauge or whatever.
Yeah, correct.
So that makes more sense. But you would have a big wire going through here, very large to handle that ampacity. So logically, you would think, okay, I need to have the same sized wire coming here because it's feeding in here. But this is where the 10-foot tap, so the 10-foot tap rule says 10% times this breaker rating. So let's say that breaker is 400 amps. So that'd be 400 amps plus the output rating of the inverter. In that case, it's 90 amps times, and I'm going to lose my 1.25. So what's 90 times 1.25? Anybody have that handy? Quarter of it is 22.5. So is that going to be 112.5?
112 and a
Yeah,
half.
112.5, yeah.
Okay, plus 400. So then we've got 512.5 amps, and that's 10%. So if this is 10 foot or less, then we've got to have 51.25, but it's a minimum 60 amp. So in this case, we would have 60 amp. But if this is anywhere between 10 foot and 25 feet, then the equation changes to 33%.
Okay.
So at that point, it's then whatever 33% of 512, which is, what's a third of 512.5?
169.
So about 170 amps.
Right.
Okay. So 170 amps. So now we're going to have to make that wire applicable to 170 amps, not 51 or 60. And the AC disconnect is going to have to be rated for that as well.
Okay.
So then the question is going to be, if you put a fuse in here, what size fuse is that going to be? And I would probably fuse it based on the output rating of the inverter. So I would put a 90 amp fuse here, but the wire here has to be rated to 170.
Okay.
Why is that again? I don't understand. There's a huge difference between 90 and 170.
Yeah. The NEC, I don't know. I don't know why they say you can't do anything more than 25 feet. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe it must have something to do with resistance, but you know, because they're worried only about the length of the wire. But I'm probably with you. I don't understand why, although there is also a big difference between 400 amps and 170. So it's nice that you don't have to go to the full 400 amp, but you do need to protect this. So yeah, Chet?
I'm just thinking that maybe the reason they're doing that is because if it ever does back up into the AC disconnect, if you had a large enough fuse in there, the wire itself might start on fire.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that has something to do with it. Of course, putting a smaller fuse here is going to pop, because the only reason you would have a problem is if there's some sort of ground fault on this part of the system, because your inverter should not be drawing power from the grid.
Right.
But if, let's say you do suddenly have a great big ground fault and all the electricity that's being serviced here tries to flow through here, whatever breaker you have in your AC disconnect is going to hopefully disconnect that load, which is what the ground fault would be. But there will be a microsecond or so where power is flowing on that line. And I guess they've calculated that's enough to protect the wire from blowing during that quick period. So, but I'm just speculating on that. So I'm sure
if that wire is big enough, then that's going to force whatever fuse is in that box to be the thing that stops current flow.
Yeah, as long as the fuse is equal to or less than, you know, the rating, it's fine. If you size it too small, then you may have some nuisance tripping, but that's usually the only problem. And since the direction of the flow should only be that direction, then as long as it's big enough to account for the output of the inverter, it should be fine. We should never see power flowing back through there, ideally. Now you may see it running here and here. You know, once it gets into the tap, it'll run bidirectionally, depending on where your load is, you know, if you're servicing the load. But anyway, those are the issues around connections. Yeah, Bill?
What version of the National Electric Code?
Oh, it's been in there a while.
Oh.
At least 2017, but probably earlier than that. Because, you know, I just know it's been in my textbooks for a number of revisions. So it's out there. And it's usually, this is straight electrical work stuff anyway. So any feeder tap that you're dealing with has that same 120, you know, or 25-foot tap rule or 10-foot tap rule. So we're going to see a lot more of these supply side connections, I think, you know, as systems get bigger. So, you know, we need to be prepared for it, but it is more expensive. You know, it's going to be more expensive because you're going to have an electrician come out and do all of that, work, and have the utility shut down the service and all of that kind of thing. Sometimes the supply tap's your only choice. You know, it might actually be cheaper if you factor in, let's say you have to drill through a wall to try and get into the service panel. And in this case, you can just tap into whatever is out there by the meter. Right?
See her Friday, or only if she feels the need to see?
I'd sort of like to see this, if you don't mind, I'd like.
Yeah, I think he was talking to someone else. Bill?
Isn't it, on the subject of a short, I've let the smoke out a couple of times on stuff, you know. Is a short generally self-extinguishing? That is, the copper melts and the circuit becomes open. Has anybody run into a situation? I suppose you either pop a fuse or get an open circuit because of copper melting. Has anybody run into a situation where you presumably popped a fuse up line that was really heavy, you know, set for heavy amps? Or is it generally a true statement that a short is self-extinguishing because of?
I have run into situations where people have said that they were feeding through the ground rod electricity into the ground for a long period of time. So that would have had to have been, clearly it wasn't a massive discharge. So it was just using the ground as a load and functioning as if you had left the refrigerator on or left lights on. I think that's an option, but I think in most cases, some sort of ground fault or a short is going to do what you said, either pop a breaker, pop a fuse, or blow out the wire. I don't know, does somebody else have experience with that where they've gotten a $4,000 electric bill because they're feeding power into the ground? So it only happens in Texas, and that just happens during ice storms, right? So, okay. Jay, did you have something to, no? Oh, you were confused about my $4,000 bill. Yeah, Texas, when they had those ice storms, they have a cost of energy plus provision in some people's contracts. And when they were paying, you know, $800 a kilowatt hour or whatever absurd fee they were paying to meet, they passed that along to their consumers. And a lot of the utility consumers in Texas were receiving $10,000, $20,000 electric bills during the ice storm there. Okay. All right, anybody else have any questions that you want to address? Devanan, did that help you out on that at all? You're still muted there.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it answered a lot of questions. I didn't know, I wasn't familiar with the 10 and the 20-foot tap rule. So that answers a lot of questions too. And the boxes and the electrical, I guess it's just a size, those junction box with the correct current rating and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, and the bus bars and the connectors and all of that. But I think it would just be one of those bus bars where you take your main line and connect to one end, take your other to continue on, and then just have some sort of tap to go into each one of those lines.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Anybody else have anything, or we'll call it a day here? We're all good? Okay. Well, we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye. Stay dry.
See you next